joining with me today. Today, the topic is an event in American religious history called the Great Disappointment. And the Great Disappointment begins with a man named William Miller. Miller was born in February of 1782 in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Those of you familiar with the geography of the United States know that Massachusetts is in the upper northeast corner of the United States in the area called New England. This is the area that was settled primarily by immigrants from Great Britain at the beginning of American history. And this was a hotbed of religious activity. It was filled with Protestantism in the forms of Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists and Episcopalians. They were everywhere, and they practiced their religion strictly, and it was extremely important to them. Miller was a Baptist. When he was 4, his family moved to New York State, and eventually he became a resident of Vermont. He took his Bible study, he took it very seriously after he served in the War of 1812. During that war, he had been in skirmishes and battles where people close to him were either injured or killed, and yet he felt he had been protected. And so he studied his Bible for a number of years. That scripture was quite clear, and that if something was hard to understand or was obscure, that it would be explained by other scriptures on the same topic. And that if you studied the scripture from beginning to end, it would answer questions that you might have. And that was his approach. And he studied very carefully. Between 1831 and 1844, on the basis of his study of the scripture, he began teaching. And he was particularly drawn to and emphasized the prophecy of Daniel 8:14. And let me read what that says. Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed or cleansed. So he was a rural farmer in New York State who began to share his view of the interpretation of this 2,300 years when the sanctuary would be cleansed. And his eschatology, his interpretation led to the belief, and this is what he taught, that the second coming of Christ, the return of Jesus, would happen in the year 1843 or thereabouts, between 1843 and 1844. He believed, using a principle of scriptural interpretation, that one day is equal to 1 year in the scripture, that from the decree by Artaxerxes I of Persia that said that they could rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, he sent out a decree, and that was in the year 457 BC. Miller went from 457 BC plus 2,300 years, ended at 1843. So he preached the imminent coming of Jesus. Now, this was different than what most people at the time believed. Most people interpreted the scripture by what we call post-millennialism. And that is that, yes, Jesus would return, but would return after a millennial, 1,000 years of peace and goodness in the earth. And then Jesus would return, that there would be a millennial of goodness and then the Lord's return. His belief differed in that he was premillennial. He was teaching people that Jesus would return first and set up his kingdom, and following this establishment of the kingdom would be the 1,000-year reign of peace, where Jesus would be with his people on the earth. Well, at first he said this would be 1843, and he set a time period. That time period passed in the spring of that year, and Jesus had not returned. Setting another date that passed, people were quite disappointed. But there, finally, the date was set for October 22nd, 1844. And on that day, now actually beginning at 6 o'clock in the evening on the day before, which would have been October 21st, our thinking is that the day begins at midnight and goes to the following midnight. Jewish days go from sunset to sunset. And so approximately 6 o'clock in the evening is when the day begins. And so many of the people who followed Miller, and they became known as Millerites, actually went outside to wait for the coming of the Lord. And many of them stood all night and all the next day and well into the following night, waiting for the return of Jesus. And it did not happen. Thousands upon thousands of people in New England and in the Midwest and in some of the southern states had followed Miller, had become Millerites. It was such a great disappointment because they were so sure that Jesus was going to return that many of them had given away all of their possessions, had closed their businesses, or left their places of employment. They had left the traditional churches which rejected Miller's teaching. And so now, with Jesus not returning, many people are destitute, without homes, without incomes. There was a great rise in mental illness following the great disappointment. Many people suffered depression. What happened to them is, of course, based upon the individual person. Some returned to their former faith. Many rejected Christianity altogether. And some joined the new churches, the new religious movements that came out of this Millerite movement. And the two basic ones were the Adventist churches that are still operational in the world today, especially in the United States, and the Seventh-day Adventist church or movement. And in the future, I'll talk specifically about that Seventh-day Adventist movement. In addition, there is a connection with the much later Baha'i faith. And when we talk about the Baha'i faith, we'll make that connection. What I'd like to do before I end today is recommend a couple of books if you're interested in this topic. The first one is called Midnight and Morning. Midnight and Morning is by Clyde E. Hewitt. And this is the story of the beginnings of the Advent Christian church movement. And that was one of the movements I said came out of the Millerite Great Disappointment. And this is a good book about that. And then also this, the controversial Christian prophetess Ellen G. White. And this tells about the founding of the Seventh-day Adventist denomination, but also gives a lot of the history of the time, the Millerite disappointment, and it's a biographical story of the founder, Ellen White, of that Seventh-day Adventist church. And this particular book is by me. I wrote this a number of years ago, and I think it's pretty informative about that time period and that denomination. So, with that, we'll end for today, and I hope you can join with me next Saturday, and we'll take a look at another group or another person or spiritual movement from our history to see how we became what we are today. And also, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and to click the notification button. Please leave your comments and questions, and I try to respond to all of them if I can. And give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. All of those things help YouTube creators to be seen by other people who are interested in the same subject. And please feel free to share this video with your friends and those who are interested in spiritual thought. And with that, I'll thank you once again for being here, and I'll see you soon.